Welcome to the third webinar hosted by the National Council of Applied Economic Research National Data Innovation Center. I'm Sonalji Desai, Professor and Center Director at NCER NDIC. I also hold a joint appointment as Professor of Sociology at University of Maryland. Thank you for joining us. On the one hand, the pandemic has taught us how important it is to have good data to help intelligent and informed policy design. On the other hand, it has also taught us how difficult it is to obtain good data. The goal of National Data Innovation Center is to foster a dialogue about how to get and use good and useful data. I am delighted that we have three excellent scholars to help us shape this dialogue. I'm particularly delighted that we have William Axinn and Stephanie Chardoul from University of Michigan, who are partners in formation of the National Data Innovation Center. I would like to invite my colleague and Deputy Director of NDIC, Dr. Santanu Pramanik, to chair this webinar and to introduce our speakers. Santanu.
Hi, thanks, Sonal, and welcome all to this NDIC third NCAER Seminar series. So we are glad to have William Axinn and Stephanie Chardoul from the University of Michigan as speakers for the third webinar in the NCAER Seminar series on data collection methodology. Will Axinn is a professor of survey research, population studies, sociology, and public policy at the University of Michigan. He is a social demographer studying community, intergenerational, and social psychological influences on marriage, childbearing, reproductive health, mental health, and natural environment. He is the director of the Chitwan Valley Family Study, a 25-year mixed method whole family longitudinal study in Nepal. I think his talk today will focus on some of the findings from that study. We also have Stephanie as another speaker today. So Stephanie is the Director of Survey Research Operations at the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center. We are fortunate to have a long-term collaboration with this unit of Survey Research Center that Stephanie leads at the University of Michigan. So during her tenure at SRC, she has been the manager of the Telephone Survey Services, Senior Survey Director, Director of the Project Design and Management Group, among others. Her substantive interests include cross-cultural survey methods, building survey research infrastructure, and mental health. Stephanie has been a member of the Data Collection Coordinating Center for the long-running World Mental Health Survey Initiative and is the director of the WHO Composite International Diagnostic Interview Training Center, and of course an integral part of the Chitwan Valley Family Study. We are also delighted to have Professor Arokiasamy as today's discussant. He is a well-known scholar in the context of demography and public health research in India. He will share his experiences of measuring mental health indicators in the LASI survey, longitudinal aging study of India. He served as faculty for over 3 decades at the International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai. Currently, he is a visiting guest professor at Center for Policy Studies, IIT Mumbai. So, welcome, 3 of you, and we are delighted that you agreed to be part of this webinar series and deliver your talk for this third webinar. So without further ado, I will let Bill and Stephanie start their presentation. Thank you.
Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. We're very happy. Thank you, Santanu, for the introductions. We're very happy to be here today to talk about an experiment we ran as part of a larger study in an effort to improve reporting and measurement of mental health in a study in Chitwan, Nepal. So the problem that we were trying to address is that retroactive reports of lifetime experiences with mental disorders greatly underestimates the actual experience of disorder because recall error biases reporting of earlier life symptoms. This fundamental obstacle to accurate reporting has adverse consequences for the study and treatment of mental disorders. So using an existing longitudinal study, we randomized more than 1,000 individuals to each arm of a retrospective diagnostic interview with and without the use of a life history calendar. And we were able to demonstrate that use of, just as with frequent measurement longitudinal studies, use of the life history calendar is effective in improving rates of reporting. This tool is practical for application in both large cross-section surveys of the general population, and also, we would like to say, could be useful in the clinical intake of new patients in the mental health setting.
Thanks, Steph. So we put together a talk with 4 parts. The first part is going to be a little bit of background on survey research on mental health, just to sort of establish where this came from. Then a little bit of background on retrospective reporting and the life history calendar because of the importance of that tool in this situation. Then we'll show you how we implemented the experiment in Nepal and the results of that experiment. And finally, we'll close with a bit of discussion about what we get out of that work. So for the survey research part, we have 3 pieces. The first piece, we want to tell you the goals in general of doing large-scale surveys on mental health. And then we'll focus in a bit more on the composite international diagnostic interview that Stephanie mentioned. And then finally, we'll discuss briefly all the work that went into adaptation for Nepal, which is a big topic in and of itself, easily worthy of its own webinar. But this is a webinar on the life history calendar, so we're just going to touch on that and then move on.
So why use survey research methods to study mental health? First of all, population prevalence helps to establish the need for treatment and helps to target preventative interventions and to prioritize that treatment. And also, especially using the instrument that we did use, we are able to identify barriers to treatment. And identifying those barriers aids in setting health policy for an area, for a country. Second, measures of the disorder must include behavioral impairments to be accurate to meet full diagnostic criteria. And we also included clinical validation, which required that a random subsample of respondents were interviewed both with the CD questionnaire and then separately examined and interviewed by a mental health clinician. And lastly, cross-cultural adaptation is crucial to the success of obtaining comparable measures across populations with different languages and cultures. And as we have found very clearly in our work with the larger World Mental Health Consortium, these different cultures and countries have actual different experiences of the disorders that we need to be sure to capture as part of the interview process. For this study, we adapted and used the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, or CD for short. The CD was the data collection tool used for the World Mental Health Survey Consortium, which was originally launched as a World Health Organization initiative in the early 2000s. And the goal of this initiative was to produce general population prevalence estimates over a wide range of mental health disorders. More than 35 countries have participated to date. We have new countries still launching currently, so it's a very active current study that was started almost 20 years ago. And all interviewing is done using the CD, which is a highly standardized instrument that can be administered by lay interviewers to generate these validated diagnoses across mental health issues. And though the interviewers that we use for this study are not mental health professionals, all interviewers are required to complete a very standard, a very rigorous training and certification process before going in the field to administer the survey. So as Bill mentioned, a big piece of this study and being able to implement it successfully was adapting the CD for use in Nepal. So the Chitwan Valley Family Study launched in 1995 as a general population sample. It's fully representative of rural Chitwan in Nepal. And all individuals, it's a household-based design. Every individual in the households is entered into a regular household registry system and had very high rates of recontact with those households, with those individuals, up until the data collection for this study, which started in 2016. And that contact is continuing on through today. In Nepal, we went through an extensive translation and cultural adaptation process. Though individuals in Nepal speak dozens of exclusive languages, we translated only to Nepali, the official language, and standardized around that. The CD has historically performed very well in European and other Western countries, but has not been so successful in Asian or African settings. So we purposefully put a lot of effort into review by local mental health professionals and conducted multiple rounds of cognitive interviewing with community members and multiple revisions of the instrument to ensure that it worked well with this population. We completed a pilot study and successfully validated the subset of disorders that we were using. And of note, unique to this study in Nepal, we modified some standard time items in the CD questionnaire to account for Nepal-specific culture of describing time. So this applies to both elapsed time, when we're asking respondents how long they experienced mental health symptoms or episodes, and also asking respondents to think back into the past, how long ago certain symptoms or episodes started. And so we made some very culturally specific adaptations to those standard items in the CD that are important to determining diagnostic results. And these references are some general references. The first one is a general description of the CD instrument at the time that it was modified for use for the World Mental Health Study. The next two references describe our process for translating and adapting the CD for use in Nepal.
I think there's a lag between when you put the next slide up and when there it is. Okay. What I'm going to talk about now is the retrospective reporting aspects of the life history calendar. I'm going to briefly comment on some of the limitations of retrospective reporting. Stephanie already touched on those. Then I'm going to talk about the problems with retrospective reports of mental health. And finally, we'll show you our life history calendar. So, retrospective reporting is always a challenge. I managed to recall my own birthday. I do a little bit less well with everybody else's birthday. And birthdays are something we celebrate every year, which makes them the easiest things to remember. Things that we don't celebrate every year on the anniversary of them become harder and harder to remember as time passes. So it's a cognitive challenge for people to remember, particularly the timing of events. And this was a big motivator for a life history calendar, even for studying very common events like marriages and births of children, which are generally celebrated every year somehow or another. So one of the keys was the discovery in cognitive science that visual cues assist human beings in remembering stuff, and visual cues about the order in which they occurred, the timing when they occurred, and connections to other events that they might remember better. And that's a key second part, is it turns out, and I'm drawing on cognitive science of human memory, not our work, but that people have some events that they remember well, and some other events that they remember less well. But remembering events that we can anchor in time allows us to remember the relative timing of other events. And so this is another important property of life history calendars. And to give you a little sense of where this went in Nepal, when we first started in Nepal in the early 90s, there were communities where somebody had been hit by a rhinoceros and killed, or bit by an alligator and killed, and that was very memorable for the whole community. In more recent times, it turns out stuff like when the king's son took a gun and killed him and his mother, that's a very memorable national event that we know the timing of, and so we could use that to help anchor people's reports for the timing. And finally, it turns out that traumatic experiences are particularly difficult to remember correctly. And there's been a bunch of recent work on brain's encoding of timing that indicates in traumatic experience, various chemicals released in the brain, again, not my expertise, drawing on the work of others, make it difficult for the human brain to encode particularly the order in which events occur. And in a place like the United States, this turns out to be a major issue in sort of police investigation of assaults, which are very traumatic for the individual involved, and it's hard for them to report back correctly. So we'll go from these sort of general problems, issues in the challenge of getting retrospective report, particularly in these traumatic areas, to sort of, yeah, it's interesting stuff. There's a long pause between when you put up the next slide and when I see it. Interesting. And I'm not sure, but I'm guessing everybody else hasn't seen it yet, so I'm waiting. Yeah, now I see it. So retrospective reports of mental health, as you might guess, can be particularly challenging to measure. And there's been a fair amount of research on this by psychologists and psychiatrists. The best research compares retrospective reports from a cross-section with prospective reports from a panel study. In fact, there's a very special panel study in New Zealand that's followed the same human beings every year for decades. And those kind of studies show that, first of all, only the most severe and enduring disorders are reported. So if somebody had a very severe case of, let's say, depression or alcohol use disorder, and that stuck with them for years and years and years up to the present day, it's easier for them to report that. Second, comparisons between prospective panel studies and these retrospective cross-sectional surveys demonstrate that only about half of some disorders are reported correctly retrospectively. So that really undermines this burden of, hey, we want to know what prevalence actually is in the population and how that varies across subgroups in the population and so forth. And of course, and it'll be certainly interesting to hear the Lassie experience with this, because I know it's a challenge that all aging studies engage a lot in. Older ages makes the retrospective recall problem even worse. And so, you know, the best method in general for keeping track of this over time are longitudinal studies. But the issue there is both that they're very expensive to maintain, and that they sort of eliminate that possibility for a whole bunch of settings and situations. And so it is useful to have a strong retrospective tool. And as Stephanie mentions, it's just as important in clinical intake, actually, to be able to get accurate retrospective reports of other conditions. And this is partly because many mental disorders are connected to other disorders in a comorbidity kind of way. So the next slide will show you a list of references about the life history calendar. Again, there's been a lot of work on calendars before now. Deborah Friedman, who was a spouse of Ron Friedman here at Michigan, and I feel fortunate to have known them both, did this pioneering work in the 80s with his first life history calendar. And this was just aimed at getting correct measures of timing of marriage and childbearing, but relative to other events. Did the marriage occur while you were still in school or after you ended school? Did the birth occur while you were still working or after you stopped working? And so the relative timing of events was a very big motivator. Former colleague Bob Belly did a bunch of work on, and he's a cognitive psychologist, the cognitive processes there. And Caspi and Moffat have done a bunch of this work comparing retrospective and prospective. They were involved in this longitudinal study in New Zealand, and they did some work on life history calendar for both a research tool and a clinical intake. And next, we'll just show you a couple references to our work on life history calendars in Nepal. We've done some work before. My first work in the late 90s, adapting life history calendars and making them more broadly possible for not just different cultures, but also for broader sets of events and longer time periods. And then there's the book that goes into the mixed methods sort of anchors of the life history calendar approach. So there's literature out there on these things. Steph, I think I look at that big, huge life history calendar and it's all yours.
Yeah. So given that background, I'll describe a little bit how we used a life history calendar in Nepal for this specific study. So though the CD questionnaire was administered using computer-assisted methods, so interviewers had laptops with the questionnaire and the laptop, and they asked the questions and entered responses to the survey directly into the laptop, we created this life history calendar as a paper-based calendar, trying to build on the visual cue benefits that Bill just mentioned. So the calendar was on this oversized, this huge piece of paper that the interviewers would bring to the respondents to each interview session. So I know this is difficult to see. The top row of the calendar is the Nepalese calendar years. So each column of the calendar is a year, and the calendar covered 60 years, which brought us to the maximum age of respondents in this particular study of mental health. And again, as Bill mentioned, the timing of important national events that occurred at the same time for everyone in the study, things like the first democratic election, rollout of a new education system, major earthquakes, the Royal Palace massacre. Those national events were pre-printed on the calendar as points in time. And then each calendar was pre-edited by the staff in Nepal with highly memorable local neighborhood events. So these were customized to the location of the respondent's household. And these included events like the start of bus service in their neighborhood, launch of a certain youth club, opening of specific hotels and schools in the area, the start of ambulance service. So again, these memorable local events that respondents would have experienced. And then the interviewer would spend up to 15 minutes with each respondent at the very start of the interview, talking with the respondent and collecting and recording important personal experiences for the respondent. So this included a complete residential history, a complete marital and childbearing history, and a complete history of educational and job change events. So the interviewer sat with the respondent, recorded all of these events on the calendar. And then respondents were administered the screening section of the CD interview with all of these events, both national, local, and personal events, fresh in their minds. When the respondent answered positively to a screening item for a disorder, the interviewer would turn from the laptop to the paper calendar and record the respondent's age at first symptoms of the disorder, the duration of significant episodes, and etc. So any time series associated with that disorder, there is a section for each disorder in this calendar. I know it's difficult to see, and the interviewer would go back and forth between the survey and the paper calendar. And at any point in the survey, if the respondent was not able to remember their age at specific key points in the questionnaire, the interviewer would turn back to the calendar and reference it and use it to probe the respondent for an accurate answer. These are just some pictures of how the administration of this interview looks in Nepal. So you see interviewers are often outside, sitting on the ground. They have their laptop with them to administer the CAPI CD instrument. And then they have these large paper calendars that they are continually referencing with the respondent to make it through the questionnaire items.
Yeah, and I promise we have versions of that calendar available online to look at, so you can look at more closely. If you have any trouble with that, just let me know. I'm happy to make sure to send you one. And it looks overwhelming, but it actually gets to be fun. And I made the interviewers interview me with it before I wrote this, so that you would so I had some experience with it. Okay, we're going to talk now about the experiment in Nepal. We're going to do this in 3 steps. This will be first step. We're going to describe the experimental design that was used to get the data. And then we're going to show you results. And we're going to show you 2 sets of results. We're going to focus first on the results for mental disorders themselves. And Steph, you mentioned the grueling nature of our adaptation to Nepal process. I want to confess 2 important things. 1, that adaptation process took more than 3 years. And 2, that adaptation process, we only translated 7 of the 20 disorders that the CD normally measures. We used clinical information in Nepal about those expected to be highest prevalence in the population to choose which 7 we translated and adapted to Nepal. But because that process is so involved, and because the measurement of behavioral impairments takes a lot of time, as many of you who are demographers know, a lot of surveys ask 1 or 2 questions about people's mood. Did you feel bad, or did you feel anxious? Do you feel down? Do you feel sad? My personal favorite to try and translate is, did you feel blue? Which is a very American word for feeling sad, and doesn't, in Nepal, it's just a color. But so this is not like that. This goes on and on about, could you eat breakfast in the morning? Did you get out of bed? Did you go to work? Did you go to, all these behavioral impairments. And it takes a lot of time per disorder. So I say that as a preceding comment, because we're only going to focus on the experimental results for the 4 most prevalent disorders. And then we're going to talk about potentially traumatic experiences and the differences there. Okay, let's talk about the experiment. Maybe mentioned a little bit about the Chiltern Valley Family Study. Thank you. And one piece of it is that the Chiltern Valley Family Study was designed to understand the impact of local community context on individuals and families. And because of that, it's a neighborhood level design. And she was absolutely correct. We have wonderful retention rates for people who were originally enrolled in the study, but we also refresh the sample every decade or so. So it was refreshed in 2008, and then it was refreshed again in 2016. So we refreshed the sample to be representative of Chitwan in 2016 before we launched this study. So the experiment involves 50 of these neighborhoods that are matched. So they're in the same, they're in clusters of 4. And we randomly selected 25 of the neighborhoods to receive the life history calendar first, and then the CD instrument. And then another 25 neighborhoods to receive just the CD. And so that's the essential design, with and without the life history calendar, with randomization at the neighborhood level. Because the neighborhoods are not all the same, there are 1,089 individuals who were interviewed with the life history calendar, and 1,400 individuals who were interviewed without the life history calendar. So the with and without is randomized at the community level, leads to a little bit different case base, but we managed over 1,000 on both sides, which is a very large experiment for this kind of thing in general. The analysis will focus on the most prevalent 4 disorders. MDD is major depressive disorder. GAD is general anxiety disorder. AUD is alcohol use disorder, which includes Steph, ALA and ALD, which is abuse and dependence on alcohol. And finally, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And recall Nepal, including this area, Nepal suffered a major earthquake in 2015, and we launched this study in late 2016. So we had a pretty recent, potentially traumatic experience. And then the structure of the CD is all screening followed by detailed diagnostics. So the screening section for depression is a little bit more like the kind of mood questions we see in other surveys. That is, it's broader, lets more people answer yes or at the high level. Steph, as I recall, it has a time threshold, though. That is that these symptoms had to have lasted for a couple weeks to get you from yeah, I felt bad one day. Sorry, everybody, that's just normal for all of us. Versus I felt bad for 2 weeks in a row turns out to be pushing you over the edge into screening positive, not necessarily a disorder. And then it goes into diagnostic assessment. So in any of these disorders, you will find many, many more people screening yes, and then fewer diagnosing that they actually have the disorder. With the life history calendar, without the life history calendar, you'll see that shortly either way. And finally, as Steph mentioned, one of the reasons the tool is useful for policy is it deals with specific symptoms, frequency and length of time, level impairment, and other aspects of treatment and services and so forth. So, it follows up on those. Hey, and I feel bad, Stephanie. Now that I look at this, I feel like I said, oh, anything with really small font you can do. Is that? I apologize.
It's okay. Yeah. It's better that we're all looking at it on our screens, right? And not on a big display. So as Bill mentioned, individuals within the study were randomly assigned by neighborhood to the 2 treatment groups. So this table is just showing demographic characteristics of the 2 groups. So the first column is individuals who did not receive the life history calendar. The second column is individuals who did receive the life history calendar. And you can see that in general, the groups did not differ on age or gender. There were some small differences in ethnic group distribution and across the 2 groups, not important differences. And there also were a small difference in education, where a slightly higher proportion of respondents who were in the life history calendar group met our education threshold. SLC is the school leaving certificate, which is equivalent to passing 10th grade and is a milestone in the Nepal education system. So, but in general, the two experimental groups looked very similar, which was good.
Okay. So now we're going to show you the disorders. Let's go ahead and look at the first slide there. So this slide again has two columns. The left side is without the life history calendar, or sort of a baseline of what would happen if you didn't do this. And the right side is with the life history calendar. How does it change? The top of this is screening items only. And as I said, more people in general screen positive to things than diagnose positive with things. And these are the four disorders: depression, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, alcohol use disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And you'll see in the depression row that about 19.5%, let's round, about 20% of people screened without the life history calendar, and almost 30% of people screened with the life history calendar. That difference is statistically significant. So more people screening in for depression. You'll see the generalized anxiety disorder change is there, but much smaller in magnitude. You'll also see that alcohol use disorder, it doesn't change. And super interesting, alcohol use disorder screening and diagnosis is based on counts of things, but not their duration. How many drinks did you have in a week? How many drinks did you have in a day? You know, this kind of thresholds of how much drinking is there, and did you have to have it over and over again? And there's not a big life history calendar influence on that type of disorder. And finally, post-traumatic distress disorder. And someone, thank you, asked a question about trauma measurement. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but I'll point out here that in Nepal, the vast majority, so post-traumatic stress disorder screening is, did you ever experience, and I'm going to be really careful in here and say a potentially traumatic experience. And I say potentially traumatic experience because we're measuring experiences which some human beings find traumatic and other human beings don't find traumatic. And, you know, Nepal had been through a pretty serious armed conflict. Everybody in this area was exposed to that conflict. Some people participating in an armed conflict and killing people is one of these potentially traumatic experiences that are traumatic for some people and not others. And, you know, in this area of which, you know, okay, armed conflict in the recent past, since the launch of the Chihuahua Valley Family Study, and recent big earthquake, and a lot of everyday stuff. As I mentioned, we got tigers and cobras and all that stuff, right? So 80% of people screen into post-traumatic stress disorder because they report a potentially traumatic experience. It is a statistically significant change with a life history calendar, getting more people screening in. Well, we'll delve deeper into that in a few minutes. The next two blocks here are the disorder diagnosis done two ways. The middle block is lifetime diagnosis of the disorder. And you will see what I'm going to call an astronomical change in depression diagnosis, going from under 2% of the sample diagnosing positive to almost 15% of the population diagnosing positive. Generalized anxiety disorder, you see a similar, I'll call it a leap, from less than 2% diagnosing positive to more than 7% diagnosing positive. Alcohol use disorder, just like the alcohol use screening, not a lot of change in that with and without the life history calendar. And then the post-traumatic stress disorder, even diagnosing, that is, you experience, but you see how low the rates are. That is, you experienced a potentially traumatic event, and were you still did you experience that as a disorder? Did it impair you? Did it influence your behavior later in an impairing way? And that's a much lower fraction, but you see with the life history calendar, we increase reporting of that also by quite a bit. The last block here is the 12 months, which is a much lower rate. That is, within the past year did you have this disorder? So the rates are lower, but again, for depression and for post-traumatic stress disorder, you see a really substantial increase that's statistically significant. Steph, I think we could go on to the next slide. I want to comment on, somebody raised a question about sort of remembering bad experiences, and absolutely, that's in fact the entire issue, is a lot of people don't. And so that's why we say, oh, of course, a longitudinal study that follows people, preferably every day. If you just interviewed everybody every day, you could feel better about having measured this really well. What we're hoping to achieve here is that the life history calendar does something better than if we didn't have a life history calendar. Now we're going to look at the same comparison with the life history calendar, without the life history calendar. Sorry, it's actually without the life history calendar first, then with the life history calendar. The left side 2 columns are males. The right side 2 columns are females. The very final column is whether or not the interaction between gender and the life history calendar itself is statistically significant. And so sticking with the screening item at the top for depression, what you see is the male response to depression screening does not change significantly with the life history calendar. The female response to depression screening does change significantly with a life history calendar, and the gender difference between males and females itself is also statistically significant. And again, I think actually this goes to the whole crux of the issue here, is how do people remember stuff? And we think one of the reasons the life history calendar is so powerful is because we go through this process of remembering all the other events first, and then have that physically in front of respondents as they're going through these items. And I'll tell you, in some of the substantive work, for example, it turns out many women find having absolutely no control whatsoever about the husband that they have to marry is depressing. And so it does depend on being able to connect up a memory of these different events, particularly if you're older. Generalized anxiety disorder, you also see, here you see a big change in the opposite direction for men with a life history calendar than for women. And that, of course, generates a statistically significant interaction between gender and the life history calendar. For alcohol use disorder, just like everywhere else, you see no difference for men and women. Alcohol use disorder is incredibly rare in Nepal. Very few women ever have a single drink, let alone enough drinks to get to alcohol use disorder. And finally, post-traumatic stress disorder. Here, you find the gender difference going entirely in the other direction. That is, it leads to statistically significant greater reporting of PTSD screening, which is the potentially traumatic experiences, among men than it does among women. And we'll focus in on those in a few minutes, but that means the gender interaction is significant. So that was screening in. The next panel is lifetime disorders, which of course is where we anticipate life history calendar will be most effective. For depression, you'll see that it's effective for both men and women. And you'll see that it's a big effect for both men and women on diagnosing positive, from about 1% to over 4% for men, but from 2.5% to 22.5% for women. And by the way, rates of depression of 22% are not uncommon in the world. If you did the same survey in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, you would find very similar results. In the United States, you certainly find very similar results. That to the with life history calendar side of this. Diagnosing with but the gender difference is nevertheless statistically significant, that it's increasing reporting more for women than it is for men. Very similar with generalized anxiety disorder, almost no change at all for men, a big change for women. So life history calendar is improving reporting of diagnoses more for women than for men. And then in the post-traumatic stress disorder, now this isn't whether you experienced a potentially traumatic experience. This is whether you were then impaired by that it was traumatic and it impaired you, your behavior. And you see a significant increase for both men and women. In fact, the difference between men and women is not statistically significant. And then you see that it actually raises both quite a bit compared to the baseline of without the life history calendar. And finally is the 12-month reports of these same 4 disorders. And you see pretty much the same pattern where it's a bigger gender difference for depression and generalized anxiety disorder, but also effective for post-traumatic stress disorder. I think we can go to the next one, Steph. The next one is going to focus on differences by age. And again, just to keep it simple, we've dichotomized age here into a very simple, less than age 30, over age 30. That for those of us who are over age 30, this wasn't some kind of, no meanness intended here. We just got a pretty even split of the sample, as you can see. Under age 30 and over age 30 gives us about 1,230 younger, 1,263 older, so a very even split of the sample. That's all this is about. You'll see screening positive. Again, kind of an interesting result. We, of course, anticipate the life history calendar will help old people more than young people because these events might have been a long time ago. But it also helps young people. So depression screening goes up for young people. The increase is larger for older people. Generalized anxiety disorder, it doesn't help young people at all, but it goes up quite a bit for older people. Alcohol use disorder doesn't change people's reporting at all. And these potentially traumatic experiences that screen you in for PTSD, it helps for both young and old people. Now the diagnoses here. Again, one interesting thing is, of course, and lots of us are demographers, and one of our favorite things about being a demographer is the longer you're alive, the more chance you have to have something happen. And that can be good things, and that can be bad things. And in this case, of course, the older people have more total exposure to the risk of having had a disorder, and also, lived through more events that might have put that in motion. But you see here that the life history calendar is helping both young people and older people report impairment at a higher rate, impairment that would lead to diagnosis. Generalized anxiety disorder, similar increase with both ages, and a bit bigger increase at the older ages in both cases. And then again, alcohol use disorder, no difference. And finally, post-traumatic stress disorder, no difference at the younger ages, a statistically significant difference at the older ages. Okay. And I guess, the 12-month follows a very similar pattern. All of the rates in the 12-month are so low, it's very hard to detect patterns in general because they're so low. Okay, this is another look at age, just to drill down for a second, which is birth cohort. As I suggested, basically the older people have lived through more experience, have more chance of getting a disorder. And so it's helpful to think about, within a birth cohort, what's the life history calendar difference? And this drills down on depression per se. On the left side, it's screening for depression. On the right side, it's meeting criteria for lifetime diagnosis, DSM-4 of depression. And then those are birth cohorts. 1957 to 71 is the oldest birth cohort in the Chihuahua Valley Family Study. 1972 to 81, a more recent birth cohort. 1982 to 1991, even more recent, and 1992 to 2001, the most recent. So in order of recency, And you get, of course, what you would expect, which is the more recent birth cohorts have had less screening in and less depression. But in each case, you see these really substantial differences in reporting of depression with and without the life history calendar, where the darker line is without the life history calendar. Okay, last but not least, by education. We've used a very simple education dichotomy here. It's the school leaving certificate, or SLC pass. Chitwan, for Nepal, Chitwan's a very highly educated, that is 100% of young people are attending school in the beginning. Of course, many don't make it to class 10, and the SLC, at least pre-pandemic, was administered in a pretty rigorous way where a lot of people did not pass the SLC exam. So SLC without is on the left, with the SLC on the right. Again, within those two, the without life history calendar on the left, with life history calendar on the right. And you sort of immediately see with the screening, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, these PTEs, all significantly higher without the SLC than they are with the SLC. And you can see those differences aren't big enough to be statistically significant, but they're visible, right? So there's some improvement with the SLC. As I say, diagnosis is about impairment, and so it puts a little bit higher burden. But you'll see here that that even with the SLC, it helps. The life history calendar helps some people, but a big education difference. Okay.
Okay, so moving along. Bill mentioned some of this already, but in addition to the general disorder prevalence rates, we also decided to look carefully at specific events that are known to result in post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are things like experiencing a man-made or a natural disaster, being in a serious accident, having a loved one unexpectedly die, being in a war zone, either in combat or as a civilian, being a refugee, being physically beaten or assaulted, or witnessing other violence. So the CD survey has a long list. There are over 30 of these potentially traumatic experiences. And as part of the survey, we asked respondents whether each of these events happened to them. And if so, we asked the respondent to recall their age at when it first happened, how many times it happened. And respondents are thinking back over their entire lifetime. So, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, Steph, I turned off my video. We can hear you, and I can see the slide.
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you. So just some general results from looking specifically at these potentially traumatic experiences. 2 or more potentially traumatic experiences is an important threshold in mental health because it is associated with significantly higher prevalence of mental disorders. So similar to the results that Bill showed previously, respondents reporting any potentially traumatic event increases with a life history calendar. But when we're looking at respondents reporting 2 or more potentially traumatic events, you see the effect of the life history calendar is even greater. And the average count of potentially traumatic events increases to an average of 2 events with the use of the life history calendar. And so here, again, we're looking at differences by gender. So the calendar increases counts for men. So this is a little bit different than the other disorders where we saw females being affected more strongly by the use of the calendar. And so here it's both reporting of any event and 2 or more events for males. And here are some references specifically on the life history calendar measurement. We have papers on the potentially traumatic experiences specifically, and then also more generally, the information we've presented here as part of this webinar on using life history calendars in general for this mental health study. And just to note that that second paper in psychological medicine also presents specific results from our clinical validation of the Nepal Life History Calendar CD. And here we show that our validation scores are very similar or better in some cases than the US National Comorbidity Survey, which uses the US version of the CD. So just to summarize here, this randomized experiment with the life history calendar produced significantly higher reports, especially of lifetime experience of mental disorders when used in conjunction with the CD. And we were able to demonstrate very good clinical validity, improving detection of disorders, but recognizing that the CD is still conservative relative to the clinical re-interview instrument, which makes us very comfortable in saying that even with the calendar, we are not over-diagnosing these lifetime disorders. The life history calendar increased the measurement of disorders in both men and women, but for depression and generalized anxiety disorder, the calendar effect was significantly stronger among women. And the life history calendar increased reports among all respondents, but there was a significantly stronger effect with our older respondents. And the life history calendar increased detection, especially among those with less education. So our interpretation is that completing the life history calendar results in enhanced recall of mental disorder symptoms through their temporal association with these key life events that we present to the respondent and that we use continuously to remind the respondent of the sequencing of these events. And for example, in depression, the respondent must recall whether symptoms lasted most of the day, nearly every day, for 2 weeks or longer. So this demands that the respondent recall both the beginning and the ending symptoms accurately enough to know that the spell covered these 2 weeks or longer. And with the life history calendar, there was a significantly higher rate of reporting symptoms that met these duration thresholds compared to those without the life history calendar. And as Bill has already mentioned, by contrast, alcohol use disorder is dependent on more simple count measures. And so it's possible that recall of the duration of episodes benefits more from the life history calendar than recall of these counts of experiences. And that's why we saw less impact of the calendar on the alcohol use disorder. So the reason for stronger effects of women is unclear. In general, women tend to have better recall of disorder, but this isn't clear if it's a function of just better memory or greater willingness to engage in the memory search tasks. There may be gender differences in the motivational effect of the calendar. And it's important to note that in Nepal, there is significant overlap of being female and also of being less well educated. And this is particularly true among older respondents. And again, careful validation demonstrates that the increased reporting is still conservative, And the life history calendar does seem to be a very practical and effective tool in both large surveys of the general population and as a clinical intake tool for new patients.
So I'll be very quick. As we said, 2 or more PTs is an important threshold, and that increase that you saw wasn't a doubling, wasn't a 100% increase, but it was a 74% increase. Steph, go ahead and zip through these slides because I want to save time for our discussant. I will tell you that we've done a bunch of substantive research using these measures. The first one, for example, is this one that deals with population prevalence of the disorders and compares it to the other World Mental Health country and shows that Nepal's actually got lower levels of disorders than others. We've done a series of papers that connect marital experiences to depression and AUD. We've done some work that connects community contextual events, not whether you were beaten or not, but whether there were beatings in your neighborhood or not, and things like the Small Farmers Development Program that promote social cohesion and social support within the neighborhood. And so, you know, it does enable a bunch of substantive work. Last thing here is that if you'd like to know more about the Chitwan Valley Family Study, thanks to Sonal's friends at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Population Dynamics Branch, we've been able to build a new website, and there's a lot of information there, including a lot of our data collection instruments are available there, and you can take a look at them in English or in Nepalese, and Nepalese is written in Devanagari script, in case that's appealing. Finally, oh yeah. Finally, we were going to say bye or namaste.
Thank you, Bill and Stephanie. That was a wonderful, comprehensive, and very detailed presentation. And if anyone wants to use such methods, I mean, this is a perfect sort of starting point. I would say it's excellent. Thank you so much. So now, I'd like to request Professor Arokiasamy to share his experiences of working with mental health indicators in the context of the longitudinal aging study.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Shantanu and Professor Sonal, for inviting me to be part of this meeting and to share my experience of LASI data collection in general on health and in particular on mental health domain or component of LASI. Let me say that the presentation by Professor William and Dr. Shifani was exciting, interesting. It's has great methodological innovation. They flagged at least 3 methodological innovation in improving measurement of mental health outcomes in population-based studies, generally, whether it's a small population or large-scale population studies. The first, I think, the most important is that in surveys, which is very difficult, but they experimented, the clinical validation of subsample of their study. That's a very important methodological innovation and contribution in improving the measurement of outcomes, prevalence estimates, and possibly it leads to more robust estimates of prevalence of mental health disorders, whether it is psychiatric disorders, different types of psychiatric disorders, or depression. So that is one innovation. The second aspect of their innovation is the life history calendar approach, which is very novel, I should say, because this type of life history is also being tried in other, like demographic health survey in estimating fertility or fetal losses, etc. But this is definitely an important novel innovation, which again they showed how the mental health outcomes, the prevalence rates improve with the use of these methodology. So this is also very important contribution, methodological contribution. And the third is, of course, the measurement of traumatic experiences and relating to the outcomes. So these are, I think, because I did not have your presentation, in terms of listening to your presentation, at least these are three major innovations in your study, which are helpful in strengthening the measurement of mental health disorders in population. That is overall about my impression of your talk. It is certainly a novel, innovative, and wonderful talk. And now the task that I was given was to talk about my experience of LASI data collection. Not only data collection experience, and also the challenges of measurement of health, particularly mental health of population in the LASI survey. As you know, the LASI being study on older population, the primary focus on health assessment was both on physical and mental health. Conceptually, you know, the mental health is also part of physical health. So we actually had 6 different domains of health in LASI survey. Because self-reported chronic diseases, mental health model, functional health, health behavior, and healthcare utilization and biomarkers. On mental health domain, if you access LASI report, there are 4 mental health measures that are presented. For anyone, if you see the report, LASI report, you will see 4 measures. The first is self-reported diagnosed prevalence of any psychiatric or neurological disorders. That's around 2%. This is self-reported diagnosed, reported by participants of LASI survey. Overall, we had a sample of 72,000 older adults in ages 45 plus in LASI. And the self-reported prevalence of depression was just 1%. Whereas, like you use the CT short form, we use, like you use the CT, the Composite International Diagnostic Interview. We use the CT International Diagnostic Composite International Diagnostic Interview short form, which attempts to assess only the prevalence of depression, major depressive episodes. So in our population, the estimate was 88% for the 45 plus population. If you age standardize this, comes to around 6%. We also use the CEST, Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale. That's the scale that originated from US. So that is more of symptoms, sub-threshold symptoms generally. So that showed a prevalence rate of around 28% for the 45 plus population. Of course, in addition, LASI had detailed information on cognitive function also on 6 domains of cognition. But you may ask why this choice of mental health measures in LASI, the choice of these measures. Before LASI in India, if you look for any, study that could provide estimates of prevalence of depression or prevalence of other psychiatric problem, etc. It's hard to find a nationwide study focused at the state or across the socio-economic spectrum, and also comparable instrument using CT or other comparable instrument. So in LASI, we decided to assess mental health in a more comprehensive manner. So we use 2 domains of assessment. One is depression, and of course, the other domain is cognition. So in the assessment of depression, we first asked the respondents about self-reported diagnosed depression. So that yielded only just 1% prevalence. Also, the neurological disorders, they didn't add up much in terms of prevalence that we can compare globally. So alternatively, we had the choice before us was we had 2 measures. One is the WHO Composite International Diagnostic Interview, short form, which is CDSF scale. This is, of course, a global tool, which is a WHO supported tool. And I am happy to note that Stefani was associated as a director of training center for the CD scale. But we use this short form scale. And we also use the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale. Both. Why? This is because of a compromise, because in the study team, there were both in favor of argument in favor of CD as well as SSD scale. But in order to reach a compromise, we decided to adopt both CD short form as well as the SSD, not the 20-item scale, but just 10-item scale. So the idea was that they would complement each other and address the needs of researchers, and also that will also be helpful to compare types of estimates. Because if CD scale was previously validated globally, but in India, the scale was validated to a limited level. There was one or two studies in Delhi and other places. But the study, the more important validation study that was done as part of SAGE survey, which I also led as a principal investigator. So SAGE Wave 1, Wave 2, Wave 3 from 2007, the CD instrument short form scale was translated in 5 major languages. Also, of course, it was translated in elsewhere in many other Asian countries. And the reason why this was that CD, as you know, provides a diagnostic tool in large-scale survey setting to actually estimate the prevalence of depressive disorders, which are regarded as major depressive disorders. And of course, CD is validated globally, and the estimates obtained from CD are comparable across countries. So of course, in CD, in LASI, we had 3 screening questions, and then those who said yes to those in terms of depressive symptoms, and then the intensity and the duration of those symptoms, we had 7 specific symptoms based question. So the reference period for CD was around 12 months. So in that sense, the CD choice was a great tool to estimate prevalence of depression by states and by socioeconomic system, spectrum. The second, of course, the SSD scale, that is, of course, a short self-report scale. That is useful for screening for depressive symptoms in the general population. So the one advantage of SSD, it screens for sub-threshold depressive symptoms. It captures more of affective disorders. So we included 7 negative items of depression and 3 positive items of depressive symptoms. And of course, we standardize all these, and the reference period here was 30 days. So the inclusion of CT and SSD was compromised for generating comparable, internationally comparable data, also to see what happens when you use SSD and what happens when you use CD short form scale. Third, of course, was cognitive function assessment. We used HRS neuropsychological assessments, adopting the methods and procedures to maximize conceptual equivalence and computed cognitive scores as per the methodological procedures of HRS. So what are the challenges that we faced in survey and in data collection in measuring mental health outcomes in LASI? Of course, LASI is the largest in terms of aging study in the world, with almost 72,000 older adults. And of course, India, everyone knows that, has remarkable contextual, social, cultural, and demographic differences across India. There were several challenges in implementing both LASI survey, a long survey, and also in terms of mental health, the component of LASI survey. The first was translation and validation of the CT as well as the SSD scale, especially CD short form scale. The first challenge was ensuring high quality professional translation of survey instrument. And in 16 languages, major languages, including in addition to English, and its validation in all the languages. There were, of course, there were numerous statal dialects. There were, in many states, there was no particular language, but people speak certain dialect. So we had to deal with all this. But in translation, what we did to standardize this translation, we used the WHO protocol for translation of instrument, which is a multi-stage protocol. Translate the professionally qualified translator, both in English and the particular language, and then review with two independent reviewers, the back translation, and then testing the translation in a setting, field testing, pre-test, in terms of pre-test. So it was a multi-stage translation of instrument, including validation. The second challenge was validation of city. We, of course, could not do a city clinical validation on a subset, like your study, like the study presented by William and Stefani. So that was one of possibly the limitation, because this is a major large-scale survey, which was not possible for us to do a city clinical validation on a subset of sample. The other challenge, of course, was investigators' training, quality of the training, and the standards of skills of the investigator. So this is a very complex survey in terms of measurement of health, mental health, so many domains of even mental health. So there was a challenge of ensuring well-qualified investigators, their training, in taking the skills to a certain minimum standard. And overall, this we try to achieve in terms of standardized training that we follow in IAPS. Not only me, many of us in IAPS, we have long experience of conducting surveys, large-scale surveys such as NFHS, the LACI, the World Health Survey, and many other surveys. And we had a kind of system how to maximize the quality of training and the skills of investigators, and also ensure that we have investigators with more or less some minimum qualifications of graduation and above. So to ensure the quality of training and skills, so the 3 stages of training, the training of trainers, and then the training of investigators, and in both sides that we had, we have both a kind of pre-test and pre-test field practice to ensure they are tested. So that is a kind of second challenge, and of course the third is to ensure quality control across the states, across languages, quality control in terms the way the questions are implemented, the survey instrument is implemented, protocols are implemented, etc. So we had, of course, a multi-stage quality control strategy. That included not only the software-driven quality control in checking data for errors, etc., but also verification, on-the-spot check and post-verification checks. So that these types of protocols we followed to ensure the data quality is achieved. So at the end, I can say, based on our experience, at the end, the estimates of prevalence of city-based estimates of around 6 to 8% from LACI. It's very close to estimates that is the estimates from other studies. That they are not large-scale nationwide studies, but other studies generally. The GBD study, India study estimate that each specific estimates, their estimates show for older population that is 45 or 50 plus. That also shows around 6% city-based prevalence of depression. As also the CESTI-based prevalence of depressive disorders. That's also, I think, other studies also estimates closer to our estimates. So in overall, we can say that the data that we have been able to achieve, because we try to address all the methodological challenges, and the data is quite rich and comparable. And this complementarity of these mental health models, different models, I think that has proved to be an advantage in kind of strengthening the validity of data. But what we need, I think, in future is a longitudinal phase to further validate these estimates, and also to assess the temporability of the findings reported in this study. Thank you. I think that's all. I think.
Thank you, Professor Arokiasamy, for sharing the challenges for conducting not so easy topic and in a diverse settings like that. So any immediate thoughts or comments, Bill or Stephanie, so that we can take a few questions.
Yeah,
I keep thinking I'm talking, but I'm not. Dr. Saab, thank you so much. That was a wonderful view in, and I have to say, I deeply, Santanu, I wish I was with you in person and we were going out to dinner after this, and I could spend another couple of hours hearing these stories about the many surveys that Dr. Saab has been involved with and directed all over India. You know, the number one thing that attracted me to move from some work in Nepal to some work in India is just as you said, so tremendously diverse in terms of the kind of adaptation and validation issues that Stephanie was describing. And you know, Nepal is diverse, but not anywhere near as diverse. Right? So it is definitely a huge challenge. It's very exciting from the methodology side, Santanu, and it's kind of a nightmare from the demographer side, Sanal, because you know, it's a lot of work to do. But then afterwards, you're always like, well, it sort of has to be the case, no matter what item you're using, that it worked better in this subpopulation than that subpopulation, and we're never 100% sure. And I think you know, there's definitely more work to be done, and all of that work should be informed by all of the work that has already been done. So thank you so much for sharing those stories. I really enjoyed that.
I just have one comment to add on to with respect to when we talk about adapting instrument and taking care of all the cultural things. I mean, the survey, the mental health instrument that we designed and we kind of adopted for our study in the Delhi NCAER region, we had actually gone to a mental health practitioner to understand, because transliteration and translation are often different, but in context of mental health, translation also doesn't work, but because it brings a lot of subjectivity, and there are like minor terms which differ in, like, you know, very how would I say, a very thin fine line, but if you cross that, I mean, your interpretation and results and data that you would get would alter significantly. So we did this process, you know, when we were adapting the Kessler-10 scale for our study, we consulted psychiatrists as to how do they kind of, what kind of language, what kind of words do they use to talk to the population in Delhi NCR, so as to, you know, help us translate better. And then when we translated, we actually got them to back translate it. And with respect to training behaviors, I think your instrument for mental health would totally fail if your training is not in place, especially, you know, like how to go about probing, what words to explain, how much can you explain a question, and the whole idea of interviewer subjectivity in context of seeing the circumstances in which a respondent is.
Yeah, thank you. So I provided a response exactly to this in the Q&A section. So we followed a very similar process of engaging local mental health professionals in
Right.
what terms they use, what language
correct,
they use.
absolutely.
We tested that.
I mean,
Yeah. So
Steph, the only comment I want to
was
make on
very
that
important.
is it's not only that, but we did it multiple times. We did it like 7 times over and over again. And there had to be more than one clinician because of course they don't agree with each other. And you know, there's a bunch of variability on that side as well. Once you're into interviewer level variability, you got to worry about each clinician. And so it is a hard process, which is one reason we limited number of disorders. The one comment I want to make before Santanu turns off the TV is, you know, that's why we limited the number of disorders we measured. And Dr. Saab, you mentioned several studies that measure versions of depression and work hard to do it well, which I think is great. I want to tell my friends here, please measure alcohol use disorder also. And the reason is because there is a strong evidence that women tend to experience internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression, and men tend to experience externalizing disorders, some of which are really awful, but alcohol use disorder is pretty common. Alcohol use disorder is very common. It's an impairment. And our work so far on Nepal shows that, yeah, when your spouse, the person you're married to, hits you, for women, it's very depressing. For men, it doubles the rates of alcohol use disorder. And so it's very hard to see the gendered nature of these mental health impairments if you don't measure something for both genders and do it in a way that fits psychiatric response. And we haven't gotten there yet, but I'm pretty confident that having your spouse have one of those disorders probably increases the chances the other spouse ends up with the other disorder. I don't know the answer to that question yet. But I'll tell you, there's a bunch of events. Birth of a child, everybody knows maternal depression is a big deal. Turns out, in a population like Nepal, where 100% of people are married and 100% of people have a baby, having a first birth increases men's alcohol use disorder by 4 times. Interesting. Sorry, I'll shut up, Santanu. I apologize.
No, that's a great sort of insights parts of the word. So I can see Pallav in the panel, so who has rich experience of working in mental health. So Pallav, if you want to share some of your experiences, if we can have 5 minutes extended session, Phil and Stephanie agrees to
Thanks, Shantanu. I think it was very interesting to hear the talk by Bill and Stephanie and Professor Arokiasamy. I think what was very interesting to hear is how using the life charts helped increase the prevalence rates. Like you got a better measurement of your prevalence rates, which was, I think, wonderful to hear as a technique, because we do use life charts, but not for diagnosing mental disorders, but for estimating age and all those. So we have them in some of our builds that we do use for our studies. But I think what would be interesting to hear a little bit more, maybe we can connect later on, is how do you get a proper assessment of the 2-week period? I think that would be a very difficult task to get. Like, which is that 2-week period that you're talking about? And I'm sorry, I didn't turn my video off. I kept on talking. So I think that's something that would be interesting to hear later, and maybe I'll touch base with Shantanu and understand that more if he gets, or if there is any reference that I could look up on.
I'm going to defer to Stephanie on if there's a reference, but I agree with you. This is a very difficult cognitive task. And that's a big reason why we turn to the life history calendar to try and get people to say, okay, are we thinking about the time after you moved to Bharatpur or before you moved to Bharatpur?
Yeah.
Was it after you moved to Bharatpur, but before the crown prince killed the king and the queen?
Yeah.
We're trying to use those events to help us and to help get that person thinking, oh yeah, that wasn't just a day, that was several weeks. But and a couple people have mentioned this in the chat, which I'm trying to respond to as well, but it is true that, of course, your measurement of that is ultimately going to be flawed. I think measurement error, yeah, in some sense, and I think Dr. Saab's points were right on a target for this. You can't really get into survey research and expect no measurement error.
I agree.
Yeah, but it would be good. The more we know about the measurement error, the better off we are. So I agree with you also.
Yeah. And I think the last point that and again, maybe you already have looked into it, is like people who were currently depressed, how did they respond versus the people who were depressed in the past? Like, were there differences in the way that they responded to the LHC? I think that would be interesting to note also. Yeah, recall.
Yeah, severe impairment is a severe impairment. In fact, our reviewers require, our NIH reviewers required us to make sure we're measuring suicides, because suicides selectively remove people from the sample. So now your sample, and my friend Susan Murphy always said this, a sample of living people is always biased. And a sample of living people in this case is biased by missing the most severe mental health crises that led to something like suicide. Total problem.
Just I wanted to add on this. I mean, if you look at even LASI data, not only on mental health, depression, but also chronic diseases, the physical health measures. If you look at the age pattern, if you look at a gross age pattern, you see that there is age-associated rise in the prevalence of chronic health conditions, different, whether it is cardiovascular or diabetes or other conditions, or for that matter, even depression. But you will find this age-associated rise is up to the age of 75. But once you reach age 75, even the gross prevalence rates, age, simple weighted prevalence rate, that tend to fall at the age of 75. That is exactly due to what Professor William is saying, that selection bias, self-select, survivor bias. So those who are in good health, they survive. And those who are in the worst health, there is a mortality attrition of people possibly with the worst condition of suicide or depression or other diseases. So we always deal with, so while generally we try to kind of interpret there is a age associated effect, but when you actually do more analysis of regression based adjustment, etc., then you find more serious problem. So it is not really a reporting problem, but it is a sample problem also.
The armed conflict was terrible for the mental health of the people who lived through it. The people who died, we don't know, but they are dead.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we are seeing in mental health, we have seen this, and we did some analysis by age and other socioeconomic determinants, and we saw this. It's very hard to explain this in terms of interpretation.
Yeah. Discussion. So maybe we can take one last question from Monica, then end the session here. So, Monica, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I think Mike is, I think she has to unmute, I think.
Okay, so since it's taking time, so maybe Pallavi, the question you posted in the chat box, so perhaps that's the only one that hasn't been answered. So Phil and Stephanie have been answering all these questions. So Pallavi, you want to ask your question?
Hi. So my question was regarding if you do you sort of contextualize the local events for women who have married into households which are in different neighborhoods compared to the native households? Because this can get difficult, right? Because you mentioned at the outset that the enumerators sort of capture local events. But in these cases, the local events will differ for women for at least a particular time span of their life, their early years. And so can this affect the count of PTs? Because, I saw that you have, so they do respond positively. It's significant for the occurrence of disorders. When you ask them about PTs, you don't really find the difference and for women. So just wondering whether this can help explain that.
Yeah, interesting point. I wrote back about the potential for the Chitwan Valley Family Study design to help us understand this better, because it is panel data, and it tracks neighborhoods, it tracks households, and it tracks individuals. So if somebody marries somebody from outside and that person moves in, we know when that person moved in, we take a life history of that person too. And so, we and if PTEs are affected by the move into this new household, we do have the ability to see whether that count or those experiences occurred before or after she joined the new household. So we can look at that. We haven't. I think it's a super interesting thing to look at. I will tell you, I care a lot about some of these gendered reporting issues, as you could tell by my responses on AUD. And I also am aware, I dabble in ethnography enough to know that I am not the appropriate gender to interview women about intimate experiences of this kind. But some of my students have, and I have always been concerned that sexual assaults are underreported in these kind of data. And my students report back to me that not only do the women they interview in the area agree, but the female staff who work for me agree that, in Nepal, especially during the armed conflict, levels of sexual assault to women were very high. And that PTE is clearly not being reported at the rates that sort of the ethnographic approach suggests it has occurred. Now, you're talking about a different kind of adverse experience. I will tell you that being hit by your spouse is reported, maybe not as high as it occurs, but it is being reported. It is a traumatic experience. And I think I've written a couple papers about this that are referenced there. And the reason I cared so much about it is in the mental health literature, marriage is generally treated as a good thing that helps your mental health. That turns out to be in general too true, but if your spouse starts hitting you, not true. If what is supposed to be this really strong source of social support is a source of trauma, it's the opposite of. And so as a sociologist who studies marriage and family, I was super interested in these kind of dynamics, and there is a lot more work to be done. But these data are designed to support that kind of work, and I hope someone does get it done.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because when you mentioned, you can, based on the survey design, you can capture what happens because of the move or after the move, but what about assaults prior to the move? So there are a lot of interesting things that, just given what you said right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I did not intend to ever work on this topic because it's really an awful topic, but my university dragged me into this, and it turns out, of course, that a whole bunch of these horrible experiences of assault happen at young ages.
Yes.
Before marriage. And so that is definitely, as you suggest, part of the dynamic that needs to be measured to understand how the marital situation then interacts with what a person's experience of mental health problem might be.
Thank you. And Sonal, any last thoughts before we close the session? I think you are muted. So.
I just want to thank everyone for a wonderful conversation. This is exactly the kind of conversation that we need to have And hopefully we will continue to have over the coming discussions from NDIC. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Professor Arokiasamy. And thank you, Santanu, for chairing and moderating the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. That was really very stimulating discussion and gives us a direction on how to better capture the events. So that's great.
It's wonderful to see everybody, and I'm bummed we can't be there in person, but it's so great to see everybody. So anytime you want to talk about something, let us know.
Okay, so bye everyone. Thank you so much.